They said a black man had no business sitting across the table from Italian crime bosses. That someone from Harlem's tenements could never command respect from men who traced their power back to Sicily. That a gangster without the Mafia's blessing was just another street thug waiting to be eliminated. Yet in the shadow of the Renaissance that painted Harlem's streets, one man would shatter every assumption, building an empire where none should have existed, negotiating when others said negotiation was impossible. The wise guys thought it was a joke at first. Whispers drifted through the smoke-filled back rooms of Little Italy about this Harlem operator making waves uptown. A numbers man, they said dismissively, as if the color of his skin told them everything they needed to know about how this would end. They sipped their wine, making predictions about how quickly he'd fall in line. Some claimed they'd personally teach him how things worked in New York, but those same men would soon discover someone who played chess while they played checkers, who understood that true power came not from the gun you carried, but from making people believe you'd use it, and who possessed something far more dangerous than violence: patience. And by the time they realized what was happening, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson had already rewritten the rules of the game they thought they owned. Imagine Harlem in 1930. On the surface, it pulsed with an energy found nowhere else in America. Duke Ellington's orchestra at the Cotton Club, the Apollo Theater launching careers, Langston Hughes walking streets where Marcus Garvey had preached. But beneath this cultural explosion, another world operated in the shadows, where the real power brokers controlled the numbers, the liquor, and the territory. Over 200,000 souls packed tight from 110th to 155th Street. Folks who'd fled Southern oppression only to find Northern discrimination wearing a different mask. The legitimate economy had locked them out completely. Banks wouldn't lend. Employers wouldn't hire except for menial labor. Police treated Harlem like occupied territory. So Harlem built its own economy, underground but thoroughly organized. The numbers game became the People's Bank, their one shot at beating impossible odds. At the top of this pyramid, in 1930, sat someone nobody expected. Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, had built a numbers empire from nothing, arriving from Martinique with empty pockets and filling them through brilliance and boldness. She ran operations that employed hundreds, managed banks that processed thousands of transactions daily, and commanded loyalty that money alone couldn't buy. She was educated, articulate, and absolutely fearless. But success attracts predators, and the biggest predators in New York were circling. Downtown, the Italian mob families had grown fat from Prohibition's illegal profits. Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello weren't neighborhood toughs anymore. They were businessmen running criminal enterprises with corporate efficiency. And like any business seeking expansion, they looked north. Harlem represented the ultimate prize: millions in numbers money, relatively disorganized competition, and a population that couldn't run to authorities already on the mob's payroll. The mob's expansion followed a predictable pattern. Representatives would approach a numbers banker with a simple proposition: keep operating, keep making money. But now you've got partners. Pay tribute and get protection. Protection from what? Well, protection from what might happen if you said no. Most bankers took the deal immediately. Refuse and your operation gets hit. Your runners get beaten. Keep refusing and you end up in the East River. Stephanie St. Clair looked at that same proposition and told them to go to hell. Her refusal shocked the Italians. Didn't she understand how this worked? But Queenie hadn't built her empire by backing down. She fought back using every weapon in her arsenal. Newspaper advertisements denouncing police corruption. Her own muscle, organizing other operators to resist. For a while, she held them off through sheer force of personality. But wars of attrition favor whoever has the most resources. St. Clair's position was deteriorating. Her gunmen were outmatched. Her political connections were worthless against men who owned judges. She needed someone who could think like the Italians thought, negotiate when possible, but fight when necessary. Someone who could walk into a room full of mobsters and walk out with a deal instead of a bullet. She needed Bumpy Johnson. Everyone knew him by the nickname that came from the large, distinctive bump on his skull. But that wasn't what made him dangerous. What made him dangerous was the mind underneath it. Bumpy Johnson in 1930 was 25 years old, average height, built solid but not imposing. Yet something about his bearing made people take notice. Maybe it was the way he dressed, always immaculate in tailored suits. Maybe it was the confidence in his walk. Or maybe it was his eyes, intelligent and calculating, watching everything, forgetting nothing. He'd been born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, arriving in a world where Jim Crow wasn't just law, but the entire social structure. His family shipped him north during his teens. The same story thousands of Southern black families lived. Harlem was supposed to be the promised land. What Bumpy found was more subtle, but equally vicious oppression. The street life claimed him quickly. He started running errands for numbers operators, learning the business from the ground up. But Bumpy understood something many street toughs never grasped. Violence was a tool, not a solution. The truly dangerous men weren't the ones who killed quickest, but the ones who killed smartest. So while he developed a reputation for being fearless in confrontation, he simultaneously developed something more valuable: a reputation for being smart. He could settle disputes without bloodshed when bloodshed would create more problems. He could read people, understanding their motivations and fears. And crucially, he understood the white power structure in ways many Harlem operators didn't. By the time St. Clair brought him into her organization, Bumpy had established himself as someone special. She didn't need more muscle. She needed someone who could match wits with Italian mobsters, who could represent her interests in negotiations with men who thought black people were inherently inferior. Their partnership formed naturally, two brilliant minds recognizing each other's value. The timing was critical. By 1931, Dutch Schultz, a Jewish mobster allied with Italian families, had taken over several major numbers operations through combinations of buyouts and violence. St. Clair's organization was one of the few holdouts, and that independence was becoming expensive to maintain. This was the crucible where Bumpy Johnson would be forged into something Harlem had never seen before: a black criminal who could negotiate with the Mafia as something approaching an equal. The first meeting between Bumpy Johnson and the Italian mob's representatives should have been his last. The Italians were sending serious men, soldiers in an organization that traced its roots back to Sicily's ancient traditions. They'd killed dozens between them, and now they were sitting across from a 26-year-old black numbers runner who had the audacity to think he could negotiate. The meeting took place in a social club in East Harlem, neutral territory. Bumpy walked in alone, against St. Clair's advice. She'd wanted him to bring muscle. He understood that would be read as weakness. Instead, he walked in wearing his best suit, carrying nothing but his reputation and his intelligence. The room fell silent when he entered. 3 Italians sat at a table in the back, positioned to see the door. They studied him, measuring, calculating, looking for signs of weakness or fear. Bumpy pulled out a chair and sat without waiting for invitation. Small move, but significant. He was establishing that this was a meeting between equals. The lead Italian, a scarred veteran named Sal Marinelli, smiled slightly. The Italians laid out their proposition. St. Clair's operation could continue, but under new management. They'd take 70% of profits in exchange for protection and permission to operate. Bumpy listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. Then he explained in a measured, respectful tone why that arrangement wouldn't work. St. Clair's organization had been built over years, customer by customer. Her reputation in Harlem was worth more than any protection the Italians could provide. The community trusted her, and that trust was the foundation of the entire operation. Change the management, and that trust evaporated. The numbers runners wouldn't work for Italian bosses. The whole thing would collapse, and everyone would make nothing instead of something. The Italians weren't accustomed to hearing economic analysis from someone they'd expected to intimidate. Marinelli explained slowly what happened to people who didn't accept their generous offers. Bumpy nodded thoughtfully, then made his counterpoint. Those men had operated alone, without community support. St. Clair's operation was woven into Harlem's social fabric. Taking it by force would be possible, but holding it, that would require cooperation from a community that wouldn't cooperate with white outsiders. Bumpy proposed an alternative. St. Clair's organization remained independent, but paid modest tribute for peace. 10% off the top. In exchange, they'd respect Italian territories downtown. Peaceful coexistence, profitable for everyone. The meeting ended without resolution, which itself was extraordinary. Bumpy hadn't been killed or beaten. He hadn't accepted the mob's terms. He'd simply introduced complexity into what the Italians thought would be a simple shakedown. He'd bought time, but not safety. St. Clair was furious when he reported back. 10%? She'd never paid tribute to anyone. Bumpy explained patiently that pride was expensive, sometimes lethally so. 10% was cheap insurance against a war they couldn't win. Before negotiations could progress, everything changed. The Castellamarese War ended with Salvatore Maranzano's assassination in September 1931. The murder reshaped New York's criminal landscape overnight. Lucky Luciano didn't want to be king of criminals. He wanted to run crime like a corporation, with different families cooperating. Territory would be respected. Disputes would be mediated. This reorganization created opportunity. The old bosses would never have negotiated seriously with a black operator. But Luciano and his generation were pragmatists. If Bumpy could deliver Harlem's numbers revenue without requiring Italian micromanagement, they'd deal with him. Race mattered less than results. When new representatives from the Luciano family requested a meeting, Bumpy came prepared with detailed accounting. Revenue, expenses, profit margins, everything presented professionally. The math was compelling. 10% of a thriving operation managed by locals who understood the market was worth more than a larger percentage of an operation they'd have to manage themselves in hostile territory. They agreed to a trial arrangement, 12% tribute after negotiation. In exchange, the Italian families would recognize Harlem's numbers as St. Clair's territory. It was compromise, not victory. But St. Clair kept her operation, her independence, and most importantly, her life. That arrangement made Bumpy Johnson something unprecedented, a black gangster with a working relationship with the Mafia. The first test came fast. A black numbers operator in Sugar Hill refused to pay tribute to anyone. The Italians wanted to send soldiers into Harlem to handle it with maximum violence. Bumpy convinced them to let him try first. The conversation didn't go well initially. The operator saw Bumpy as a sellout. But Bumpy asked a simple question. How many Italian soldiers could he kill before they killed him? Maybe 2 or 3, if lucky. And then what? They'd send more soldiers, take over his operation anyway. All that blood for nothing. Or he could pay the tribute, stay alive, stay in business. The operator eventually agreed. The incident established a pattern. When conflicts arose between Harlem operators and mob interests, Bumpy became the mediator. Neither side loved him for it. Harlem saw him as the mob's tool. The mob saw him as unreliable. But both sides needed him, which gave him power. The real education came through watching Dutch Schultz's operation. Schultz had muscled into Harlem's numbers through sheer violence. His success was undeniable. He controlled more territory than St. Clair, made more money. But Bumpy noticed something crucial. Schultz was hated. His operators were feared, but never respected. Communities didn't protect them. St. Clair's operation, even after paying tribute, retained something valuable: community support. Her runners were neighborhood people. When police raided her operations, locals warned her in advance. She'd built her empire with the community's implicit consent. Bumpy filed that lesson away. Power in Harlem came from the community, not from downtown backing. By 1933, Bumpy Johnson had become indispensable. He controlled something the mob needed and couldn't seize through force: access to Harlem's criminal economy. The numbers only flowed when the community participated voluntarily. Harlem's residents wouldn't willingly work for mob-controlled operations. They'd work for Bumpy Johnson. This created a paradox. The mob was stronger, but needed him. He was weaker, but had leverage they couldn't eliminate. Walking that line required political skills most gangsters never developed. He made himself valuable through services beyond tribute collection. When disputes arose between Harlem operators, he mediated. When police heat intensified, he knew which cops to pay and how much. He became an intelligence source, telling the mob which of their black subordinates were skimming, which were reliable. But providing services to the mob created problems with Harlem's residents. Many saw him as a collaborator who'd sold out for personal profit. These accusations hurt, particularly because some were partially true. He did benefit from his mob relationships, but he also prevented violence that would have killed Harlem residents. His collaboration, however uncomfortable, was a form of protection. The tension erupted in 1935 during a dispute about territory. Dutch Schultz wanted a new numbers operation in Sugar Hill, technically St. Clair's territory. The mob conveyed to Bumpy that St. Clair needed to either absorb the operation or let Schultz take it. St. Clair exploded. She refused absolutely. Bumpy tried to explain the realities. Schultz was mob-connected and crazy. Fighting him would mean fighting his Italian backers. Better to compromise now than lose everything. This was the choice that defined Bumpy's career. He could side with St. Clair and probably die in the pointless war that would follow. Or he could break with her, protect her despite herself, and accept accusations of betrayal. He chose survival. He went back to the Italians with a proposal. St. Clair would step back from operations, officially retiring, though keeping her financial interests. Bumpy would take over management, absorbing the Sugar Hill operation and paying increased tribute. Everyone saved face. The Italians liked it. Schultz accepted it grudgingly. St. Clair hated it, but had no good alternatives. Bumpy had essentially staged a coup. She never forgave him, though later events proved his choice had saved her life. The takeover established Bumpy as Harlem's preeminent numbers banker. He consolidated St. Clair's operation with several smaller banks, creating an organization large enough to be mob-relevant but not threatening. He employed hundreds of runners, managed dozens of collection points, processed thousands of bets daily. But running this empire required more than criminal organization. His approach mixed calculated generosity with strategic brutality. He paid his runners well above market rate, creating loyalty. He settled customer disputes fairly. He contributed to community causes, funding church programs and youth activities, creating a public image as neighborhood benefactor rather than criminal exploiter. This wasn't altruism. It was investment in community support that made his operation sustainable. But generosity only worked when backed by credible threats. People who stole from his organization disappeared. Informants were found beaten. Bumpy didn't kill casually, but he killed when necessary, ensuring those deaths were public enough to deter others, but discreet enough to avoid excessive police attention. The key to his success was understanding different audiences required different performances. With the mob, he was deferential but confident. With Harlem's criminals, he was the powerful boss. With the community, he was the neighborhood kingpin who'd succeeded despite white efforts to keep black people down. Managing these multiple identities required constant vigilance. The mob noticed that Bumpy handled provocations Schultz couldn't, maintained operations Schultz disrupted through recklessness. Some Italian bosses began questioning whether they'd backed the right horse in Harlem. This growing respect created opportunities, but also dangers. Schultz began making noise about Bumpy getting too independent, suggesting Harlem needed consolidation under his management. If the Italians signaled approval, Bumpy would be dead within days. Bumpy heard about Schultz's maneuvering through his intelligence network. He couldn't match Schultz's firepower in direct confrontation, but he could make the cost of attacking him prohibitively high. Most importantly, he positioned himself as the stable alternative. While Schultz became increasingly erratic, threatening prosecutors, Bumpy remained calm, professional, reliable. By 1935, several mob factions were discussing whether Schultz had become a liability. His threats against prosecutor Thomas Dewey particularly worried them. Killing a prosecutor would bring heat nobody wanted. The commission ordered Schultz to back off. He refused, growing more belligerent. In October 1935, the commission authorized Schultz's murder. The hit went down on October 23rd in a Newark chop house. For Bumpy, Schultz's death was both opportunity and test. The mob needed someone to consolidate Schultz's orphaned operations, maintain revenue flow, prevent war. They turned to Bumpy Johnson. The assignment was clear: consolidate operations, maintain revenue, prevent chaos. Do this successfully, and Bumpy would control most of Harlem's numbers. Fail, and he'd be replaced. Bumpy approached the challenge methodically. He identified Schultz's key subordinates and made them offers, better terms or unemployment. Most took the deal. He addressed competing Harlem operators, explaining new territorial arrangements, making clear the mob had designated him to manage consolidation. He reassured the community that consolidation wouldn't mean exploitation, honoring outstanding bets, making visible contributions to churches. The consolidation took 6 months, but when complete, Bumpy controlled approximately 70% of Harlem's numbers operations. He'd become, at 30 years old, one of the most powerful criminals in Harlem. More importantly, he'd proven himself to the mob. They'd given him a nearly impossible task, and he'd delivered smoothly. That success earned respect that transcended racial prejudice. By the late 1940s, Bumpy Johnson had achieved something unprecedented. A black gangster running a major criminal operation with partial autonomy from the Italian mob. This arrangement worked because it benefited everyone involved. The mob got reliable income without management headaches. Bumpy got to build his empire his way. And Harlem's community had a local operator rather than outside exploitation. But underneath the surface, pressures were building. The mob was evolving, becoming more corporate. Harlem was changing too, with new migrations bringing different communities. And Bumpy himself was changing, growing from a street-smart operator into something more complex, a genuine power broker. He invested carefully in properties and businesses, buying apartment buildings, investing in restaurants and nightclubs that served as fronts, but also as real economic enterprises employing neighborhood residents. This strategy laundered criminal proceeds, created community goodwill, and provided alternative income streams. But it also created vulnerabilities. Properties could be seized. Every legitimate asset was potentially leverage for enemies or investigators. His relationship with Harlem's community was fascinatingly complex. He was a criminal running illegal gambling that extracted money from poor people. Morally indefensible. But the numbers operations kept money circulating within Harlem rather than flowing exclusively to white-owned businesses. The runners and bankers were community members earning decent money. It was exploitation, absolutely. But it was internal exploitation in an economy where external exploitation was the only alternative. Bumpy understood this moral complexity and used it strategically. He presented himself as a community benefactor. He funded scholarships, provided Christmas dinners for poor families, quietly paid rent for people facing eviction. These weren't empty gestures. The help was real, but it was also strategic, building social capital that protected his criminal operations. His relationship with Harlem's churches illustrated the contradiction. Officially, churches opposed gambling. Preachers denounced the numbers from pulpits, but those same churches accepted donations from Bumpy's foundation. The preachers knew where the money came from, but they also knew their communities needed resources the legitimate economy wouldn't provide. So they accepted the criminals' money while condemning the criminal activity. This community standing gave him power the mob couldn't replicate. When Italian mobsters dealt with Harlem, they were outsiders imposing will through force. When Bumpy dealt with Harlem, he was a community member navigating shared spaces. The Italians increasingly relied on him not just for tribute collection, but for community management. He became, in effect, the mob's Harlem administrator. This role was profitable, but exhausting. He was constantly mediating between mob demands and community resistance. The stress manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. He developed a reputation for being unflappable, but people close to him saw the toll. He drank more, slept poorly, grew more suspicious. The late 1930s brought new complications as World War II approached. The draft depleted his workforce, but military service created new black markets. Rationed goods could be diverted for enormous profits. Bumpy moved into these areas cautiously. Understanding federal authorities took wartime black markets seriously. He managed risk by staying relatively small, taking profits, but never becoming so significant as to attract serious federal attention. This restraint was a mark of his maturity. Young hustlers grabbed every opportunity. Experienced operators understood that the best opportunities were often traps. The war years also changed Harlem's racial dynamics. Black soldiers came back expecting something better, less willing to accept pre-war status quo. This energy fed into early stirrings of what would become the civil rights movement. Bumpy positioned himself carefully. He supported some civil rights organizations financially, though always quietly. He avoided any criminal activities that could be portrayed as black exploitation, staying away from prostitution and drug dealing even as other criminals expanded into those areas. But he also understood that changing times might make his way of life obsolete. As the legitimate economy slowly opened to black Americans, the numbers game's appeal might decline. These were long-term concerns, not immediate threats. But Bumpy was playing a long game now. He couldn't stay on top forever. The question was what legacy he'd leave behind. Night in Harlem has a way of talking to a man. Not loud, never loud. It's the soft conversations that bend a life. The hush of tires on wet asphalt. The shiver of a bass line leaking from a club door. The clink of a bottle and the creak of a fire escape as somebody you'll never know leans out to taste the air. After the applause fades and the business of the day is put away in drawers nobody opens, that's when you can hear a man think. And Bumpy Johnson did a lot of thinking. He sat by the window with a book in his lap and a chessboard pushed off to one side, as if the next move could wait until the city breathed him an answer. He liked the old philosophers, not because they made him soft, but because they made him steady. Lines he could carry like a pocket watch and check when the room got too hot. Endure and renounce. The obstacle is the way. A man could run a street with those words if he listened right. Mamie would pass by in her robe, one hand around a coffee cup, the other brushing his shoulder the way people touch a railing on a staircase they trust not to break. She brought light into rooms he would have kept dark, and Bumpy, who prided himself on knowing the weight of every object in his reach, learned that some things, like a good woman's patience, were too heavy to measure and too soft to name. "Another late one?" she'd ask. "Another quiet one," he'd answer, and turn a page. He didn't read to escape. He read to sharpen. Because power wasn't a fist so much as a question. Why do men move when you speak? Is it fear or respect? Both can make a man step aside, but only one keeps him from stepping back in when your shadow passes. Bumpy took inventory of his own shadow nightly, the way a banker counts money. He knew the difference. Out on Lenox and 7th, the city was changing. The big band nights were thinning into something tighter and quicker. Notes pressed like secrets at the back tables. Bebop wasn't for dancing. It was for understanding. You didn't chase it, you followed it. And if you couldn't keep up, it left you where you stood. Bumpy liked that. It reminded him of the people who tried to map Harlem with rulers and columns and forgot that you can't measure a river by the bridges across it. He'd slip into a club after midnight, hat low, coat open, and lean against the wall near the bandstand. A piano would start where the horn left off, finding a path through the air like a knife through cloth. The drummer's brushes swept a quiet street you could walk down without losing your place. The bass kept an older promise. In the half-light, you could make out faces. Musicians, hustlers, church mothers in their weekday clothes, young men learning how to move in a room without announcing themselves. The band would flash a grin when they recognized him. They always did. Not because he was famous, but because he was constant. He paid the tab. He kept the peace. He understood that art needed quiet to grow and money to live, and he was careful with both. That was the thing about Johnson. He had rules. They were not written where a cop or a priest could point at them, but they existed just the same. No harm to the people who weren't playing the game. No mess that bled into Sunday mornings. No loud debts. No unpaid musicians. Children got shoes in winter. Old men got coffee and respect. And if a landlady whispered in the right ear that a family was a week from the street, a roll of bills would appear as if the wind had learned arithmetic. People told stories about that. Some were true, some got truer in the retelling. Either way, stories are a kind of money, and Bumpy let them collect interest. He was not naive. Every favor is a ledger line. Every gift has a string you don't pull unless you have to. But he understood that life in Harlem ran on more than contracts. It ran on regard. He said once to Mamie, half a joke, half a prayer, a man can own a block and lose a soul, or he can hold a soul and the block keeps itself. She laughed because she loved him, and she didn't argue because she knew he believed it. Politics drifted in and out of his orbit the way weather does. Noticeable, inconvenient, never fully obedient. Uptown speakers on soapboxes, downtown men in suits, pastors who could lift a crowd with 2 fingers and a headline. Bumpy respected a voice that could move 100 people without raising itself. He also respected a door that could be opened quietly on a Tuesday afternoon to make a problem go away. He knew where the levers were. He also knew that some levers pulled back. At home, the evenings were domestic in the way that keeps a man from turning to stone. Mamie cut flowers short and put them in a low bowl, white ones when she could get them, because she said white was the hardest color to fake. She'd play records low, needle dancing a soft circle, while she wrote notes to herself about some place they might visit, or something they might cook. Bumpy would take his shoes off at the rug and feel, with a kind of awe, that he had made a life where a man could be gentle and not be taken for weak. He had friends who were poets, and friends who were practical. He listened more than he talked when either came around. A poet told him late one summer night that Harlem was a word people used to mean a promise they didn't know how to keep. Bumpy said, "Then I guess I'm in the collection business." They both laughed because it was too true not to. There were, of course, the other men, the ones downtown whose names looked good on a building and smelled like tobacco in a private room. They had their own rules, carved in marble and appetite. They liked a clear line of credit and a clear line of command. They trusted a handshake until they didn't. Bumpy knew them old and new, and they knew him. You don't survive where he stood without learning how to be necessary to people who could crush you by leaning back in their chair. He made himself necessary by being the one who could keep Harlem calm enough to be profitable, interesting enough to be worth the trip, and disciplined enough that the wrong kind of attention wouldn't stick. That was his art. But art has a cost. Responsibility is a clean word for a heavy thing. He slept light. He learned to read the silences in a telephone line. He stood in windows and looked at the street the way a sailor looks at the sea, loving it, fearing it, grateful for the days it didn't try to drown him. He trained boys who wanted to be men and reminded men who wanted to be kings that a crown is a ring of thorns you pay for, daily with small pieces of yourself. He kept a ledger in his head of threats and debts and promises made in the kind of dim rooms where honesty goes to lie down and rest its eyes. On Sundays, he let Mamie set the pace. They'd stroll, and people would nod with the particular kindness a neighborhood gives to people it has decided to keep. A little girl with blue berets once ran up to him and announced that her mama said he was a good man who knew bad things. He knelt and told her he was a student like everybody else, and that the world was a school so big nobody ever graduated. She seemed satisfied. Children often are when you tell them the truth gently. In the 1940s and early 50s, Harlem wore 2 faces, the public smile for visitors who wanted music and myth, and the private one for the people who had to make rent on Monday. The old glamour was changing coats. The big dance palaces were aging. The small rooms were getting smarter. A horn would argue with a piano and win exactly half the time. In dark corners, new languages formed: political, musical, spiritual. People talked about housing and schools and jobs and the particular fatigue of always having to explain why you deserved what other folks didn't have to ask for. Bumpy listened. He didn't always agree with methods, but he rarely disagreed with the goal. He thought, privately, that dignity was a paycheck nobody else could sign for you. He played chess in the barbershop when he could. Quiet mornings, floor swept, the smell of talc and clove oil soft in the air. The board steadied him. You learn from chess that pressure applied early tenderizes the endgame. He liked a queen in the corner and a knight where nobody expected it. He liked pawns that remembered where they came from and didn't apologize for wanting the 8th rank. He taught a boy how to castle one afternoon and then made him practice shaking hands after a loss. Winning feels natural, he said. Losing requires manners. The barber put his razor down to clap softly. Everybody laughed. Evenings. He drove slow. A good driver can make a city smaller without folding it. He knew which blocks to kiss with his headlights and which to leave alone. Sometimes he would stop outside a church basement where volunteers set up long tables with soup and bread and kindness. He'd watch from the car a minute and then send a man in with dollars and no explanation. Anonymous is a luxury. He bought it when he could. The future announced itself like a cough in another room. You could ignore it while the music played, but not forever. New money was whispering. People in suits you didn't recognize started visiting people you did, and leaving them nervous or rich. Boys on corners with restless hands talked about quick fortunes that required a different kind of courage and a different kind of funeral. You could smell a change if you knew how. Bumpy did. He didn't like the scent. Everything rots if you keep it too long, he told Mamie. Fruit, a lie, a truce. She took his hand. So you eat while it's ripe, she said, and you tell the truth when you can, and you remember that peace is a garden. Some seasons are lean. You plant anyway. He smiled in that shy way he saved for her. It was the one expression in his catalog that didn't have a price. There were nights he'd park near 125th and just sit, letting the street move around him. Donkeys and diamonds, silk and salt. Street preachers with sermons that could strangle a man with his own doubts, and comedians on stoops cutting through despair with a sentence. He thought often about how a neighborhood is a choir singing a song no one person knows all the words to. He tried to be a good conductor when the song threatened to fall apart. Men from downtown would sometimes ask, in voices that melted butter and froze blood, whether he had considered expanding, diversifying, modernizing. People love new words for old hungers. Bumpy would tilt his head and answer with the soft firmness of a man who had learned that saying no slowly often sounded like maybe to dangerous people. He was careful to make the no mean no without encouraging anybody to test it. He wasn't a saint. Saints don't keep ledgers in their heads or blades in their shoes. But he believed in a shape to things, a line you draw and then stand on even when it rains. He believed that Harlem deserved defenders, not owners. He believed that a man's reputation ought to be a coat you hang where children can't reach it and fools can't steal it. He believed in paying musicians, respecting teachers, and tipping doormen who remembered your name. He carried grudges like postcards, small, dangerous edges he didn't handle more than necessary. He forgave when it was profitable and forgot when it was safe. The last of the old nights came quiet as a library. There was a lull when the city seemed to hold its breath, and if you didn't know better, you'd think peace had decided to settle in. But Bumpy knew better. Calm is often just the part of the song where the drums wait their turn. He felt the beat coming, a new rhythm with cheaper rules, and a higher body count. Before the storm, he doubled down on the rituals that had kept him human. Breakfast with Mamie at the table by the window. Eggs done the way he liked. Toast with a corner unbuttered because he was superstitious about clean edges. Chess on Tuesdays. A walk on Wednesdays past the bookstore where the clerk always pretended not to know him and then slipped a title into his bag he hadn't paid for because debts come in strange denominations. He told jokes with the undertaker, traded recipes with the grocer, and gave a nod to the cop who pretended not to see what everybody saw, because sometimes mercy wears a badge, and sometimes it doesn't. He visited a school one afternoon where a teacher had invited him to talk to the boys about discipline. He told them lack of money wasn't a sin, and envy was. He told them gravity is real, the kind that pulls you down, and the kind that pulls you home. He told them a man should learn to apologize to a mirror and mean it. The teacher cried a little afterward and said she wished the world were kinder. Bumpy said, "It is, sometimes." But kindness doesn't ring a bell when it arrives. You have to be listening. On his way out, a janitor pressed a small paper bag into his hand. Homemade candy, wrapped in wax paper with the care of a mother. "You keep us safe," she said. He shook his head. "We keep each other," he replied, and tucked the bag inside his coat like a letter he planned to answer. The city's mood tilted. The clubs changed their set lists. The whisper networks shifted addresses. Younger men with hungrier eyes began to test the edges of the map he had drawn. He stopped sleeping by a window. He counted the seconds between a knock and a voice. He made arrangements, and then made arrangements for the arrangements. If survival is a language, Bumpy spoke it fluently enough to teach. But even fluent men forget a word now and then when the storm is loud. The night before the new era formally announced itself, he stood in the doorway and watched Mamie pin up her hair. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, eyes on the mirror. "I think about staying," he said. "Every day I decide to stay." "That's almost the same thing." She smiled in the glass. "Almost," she said. He turned the chessboard around and stared at a position he'd seen 100 times. A bishop hobbled by pawns. A knight that couldn't decide whether it was brave or foolish. He slid a rook and made a corridor for the king. Sometimes you defend by moving forward. Sometimes you attack by holding still. Harlem waited. It always did. Trains roared and settled. Cats argued secrets in the alley. Somewhere, a trumpet tested a phrase until it stopped lying. A boy rehearsed a speech he'd deliver 10 years from now. A girl dreamed a dress into existence and woke up knowing how to sew it. An old man watered his windowsill ivy as if it were a blessing that might return the favor. And Bumpy Johnson, not saint, not monster, not myth so much as a man trying to stay whole in a business designed to take the most important pieces first, closed his book and stood. "The thing about a crown," he said to no one in particular, "is that it keeps your head warm until it doesn't. Then it just makes you easier to find in a crowd," he put on his hat. He kissed Mamie's forehead. He stepped into a hallway that smelled like wood polish and the stubborn kind of hope. The door clicked shut behind him, and the music that had been building for years finally found its downbeat. Power ages faster than the man who wears it. By the early 50s, Bumpy could feel the metal cooling against his skin. The streets still bent his way, but they did it slower, like an old dog rising from the floor, respectful, obedient, but no longer quick. Harlem itself had changed tempo. The horns were sharper, the suits louder, the patience thinner, and every favor called itself an investment now. He'd wake before sunrise, long before the neighborhood began to stir, and watch the pale light pool over the brownstones. It reminded him of dawns in the penitentiary, when the sun was something you measured through bars. Freedom, he thought, is just a different kind of confinement. The kind where you choose the locks yourself. Mamie would bring him coffee, dark as confession, and tell him to eat. "You don't rule on an empty stomach," she'd say. "You negotiate." He'd smile and take a sip, wondering when his kingdom had turned into a ledger. In Harlem, kingship was a full-time apology to every person who believed you owed them a miracle. Rumors had become their own currency. Names swapped hands like cards. Bumpy heard himself described as both savior and parasite within the same breath. It didn't bother him the way it once might have. He'd learned that public opinion is like jazz. You can suggest the melody, but the crowd decides what key it ends in. Still, he noticed the whispers getting younger. The men repeating them were boys once, and now they were hungry in ways he recognized. That was the danger of teaching the game. The students eventually want the board. He spent afternoons walking the old haunts, nodding to store owners who owed him small debts of gratitude. The baker, the tailor, the woman who ran the corner cafe where the coffee always tasted of cinnamon and survival. They smiled differently now, less wide, more cautious, as if warmth had become a resource to ration. He couldn't blame them. The city was drifting towards something faster, slicker, and less forgiving. The neighborhood was learning a new language, one he could read but refused to speak. At night, he'd find himself outside the Savoy's old footprint, staring at the building that replaced it. The dance floor was gone, the laughter buried under new paint, but sometimes, when the wind carried right, he swore he could still hear a trumpet flirting with eternity. He closed his eyes and saw ghosts dancing in the corners, men in hats tipped low, women in dresses that glowed like midnight promises. He missed that Harlem, not for its safety. There never was any, but for its rhythm. the way even trouble moved in time with the music. He'd begun writing notes in a small black book, things he didn't intend anyone to read. Thoughts, debts, questions without answers. What is loyalty worth once it costs more than fear? When does protection become possession? Sometimes he'd quote a line of Marcus Aurelius or the Psalms, then cross it out. There are only so many ways to tell yourself that control is an illusion. The police pressure was constant, but quieter now. Polite visits, offers wrapped in civility. A detective he half respected told him over coffee that he could make things easier if he'd simply modernize. Bumpy laughed. "You mean pick a side?" he asked. "You already have a side," the man said. "You just haven't admitted which one it is." Bumpy didn't answer. Silence can be a verdict when delivered correctly. There was still beauty. Harlem never ran out of that. It hid in small mercies. A child's chalk drawing on a stoop, a saxophone warming up behind a cracked window, a couple slow dancing on a Sunday stoop because the radio worked and the rent was paid. Bumpy tried to hold on to those moments, to convince himself that as long as people could still dance, the city wasn't lost. But he could feel the new century whispering through the keyholes. It sounded like a siren in a minor key. He took to driving at odd hours again. The streets looked different at 3 a.m. Cleaner, lonelier, more honest. He'd pull up near the river, engine ticking, and watch the water carry the city's reflection downstream. Once, he told Mamie he envied the Hudson. "It doesn't keep what it sees," he said. "It just moves on." She answered softly, "Maybe that's why nobody trusts it." Letters began arriving from men in prison, old associates, small-time dreamers, each one starting the same. "Bumpy, I know you're busy, but..." He read them all. Sometimes he answered with money, sometimes with silence. Mercy, he'd decided, had to be specific, or it wasn't mercy at all. He visited the old preacher on 135th one evening. The man poured him tea and asked, "Do you ever think about how you'll be remembered?" Bumpy smiled. "Only when I'm trying not to sleep." The preacher nodded. "Reputation is what people call your shadow when you're gone. But shadows lie. They stretch, depending on the light." Bumpy looked at his hands and said, "Then maybe I'll stand in the dark a little longer." As the decade edged forward, whispers of the drug trade thickened in the alleys. Young men in sharp suits, impatient, convinced they'd found the shortcut Bumpy never took. He watched them and felt something between pity and dread. The rules he'd lived by, don't poison your neighborhood, don't make chaos a business plan, were already being rewritten by greedier pens. He thought about intervening, then thought about gravity. You can warn a falling man, but you can't teach him to land midair. Still, he wasn't finished. Not yet. He tightened the circle, looked after his people, made sure the old debts were honored. He told Mamie that when history changed tempo, the only dance worth learning was patience. "They'll call it slow," he said, "but slow keeps you breathing." She touched his cheek and said, "Just don't mistake breathing for living." He promised he wouldn't, though he wasn't sure he knew the difference anymore. There were flashes of humor. At a small restaurant one night, a waiter new to the neighborhood spilled soup on his coat and went pale. Bumpy handed him a tin and said, "Now it's a custom design." Laughter rolled through the room like fresh air. He liked moments that reminded people he was human. Monsters don't tip. On the corner of 116th, he helped a boy fix a broken bicycle chain, greased dark under his fingernails. The boy looked up and said, "My uncle says you're important." Bumpy smiled. "He's mistaken. I'm just available." The boy didn't understand, which was fine. Understanding too early is a kind of curse. The city hummed toward its next act. Photographers started pointing their lenses at decay instead of glory. Writers traded romance for reportage. The old glamour was fading under the harsh flashbulb of realism. Bumpy kept reading his philosophers, but he added poetry now. Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks. He said he liked the way they told the truth without shouting. One night, he dreamed he was playing chess alone, and every piece on the board was him at a different age. The pawns were boys with ambition, the rooks men with regrets, the king an old version of himself too tired to move. He woke sweating, unsure whether he'd won or survived. When he told Mamie, she said dreams like that mean a man's still searching for his peace. "Maybe peace is just the part of the fight you don't remember," he said. She kissed his forehead and whispered, then promised to forget often. By the time dawn thinned the night again, Bumpy was already at the window. Harlem stretched below him, 1,000 stories stacked on top of each other. Somewhere, a train wailed. Somewhere else, a baby cried. Life was loud. Life was fragile. Life was his responsibility, whether he'd asked for it or not. He adjusted his tie, pocketed his thoughts, and stepped into the day. The crown hadn't fallen yet, but he could feel the weight shifting. And as every wise man in Harlem knew, balance is what separates a ruler from a relic. The 1950s marked a fundamental shift as heroin exploded through urban America. The profits were enormous, easily eclipsing what numbers could generate. But heroin also brought heat that numbers never attracted. Federal agencies treated narcotics trafficking as a priority. Sentences were harsh, and unlike gambling, heroin visibly destroyed lives, devastating families, generating crime as addicts stole to feed their habits. Bumpy faced pressure from multiple directions to enter the heroin trade. The mob wanted him to manage distribution in Harlem. Some of his own people pushed him. Even some community members suggested he get involved, reasoning that if Harlem's drug trade was inevitable, better to have someone local controlling it. He refused, absolutely. Partially, he genuinely believed heroin was different from gambling, that it destroyed communities in ways numbers never had. But practically, he also understood the risk-reward calculation was terrible for someone in his position. The money was huge, but the heat was proportional. And drug trafficking carried sentences that would effectively end his life. He was in his 50s. A 10-year sentence meant dying in prison. The risk wasn't worth any profit. His refusal created friction with the mob. If Bumpy wouldn't manage distribution, they'd find someone who would. They began working with other Harlem criminals, younger men without Bumpy's scruples. This threatened his position. If the mob could get what they wanted from others, they didn't need him. He responded by making himself valuable in new ways. He couldn't control narcotics distribution, but he could provide intelligence about who was selling, where product moved, which cops were looking the other way. This information had value to the mob and to law enforcement. Bumpy never became an informant traditionally, never testified or wore a wire, but he passed information selectively, to both sides, always carefully, just enough to remain useful. This was perhaps his most morally questionable period. He'd rationalized gambling as providing a service people wanted, but providing intelligence about drug dealers while refusing to deal himself was having it both ways. Even he struggled to justify this. But the alternative was irrelevance, and irrelevance in his world meant death. By the mid-1950s, Bumpy had become an elder statesman of the underworld, someone whose career had outlasted most contemporaries. He'd survived for over 25 years at the highest levels, statistically improbable. Most major criminals ended up dead or imprisoned long before reaching his age. But survival came with scars both visible and invisible. The visible scars were physical, old injuries bothering him, health problems like high blood pressure and heart trouble. The invisible scars were psychological. He'd ordered or participated in dozens of killings. Unlike psychopaths who felt nothing, Bumpy remembered every face. He also carried the weight of everyone who depended on him. Hundreds made their living through his organization. This dependency was power, but also responsibility. The isolation had deepened over years until it became his default state. He trusted perhaps 3 people in the world, and even that trust was qualified. Everyone else was either potential threat or tool to be used. This sounds coldly sociopathic, but it was survival logic in an environment where trust was routinely exploited. His marriage to Mamie endured, which itself was remarkable. She provided something irreplaceable, a space where he could drop the performance, where he didn't have to be Bumpy Johnson, the legendary gangster. She knew him completely and loved him anyway. But even with Mamie, there were limits. Some decisions were too dark to speak aloud. The Harlem he'd helped shape was changing rapidly. Urban renewal projects were destroying community fabric. Old tenements were being demolished. The projects that replaced traditional housing created concentrated poverty that would generate problems for decades. The heroin epidemic was accelerating, and his decision not to participate was looking simultaneously principled and commercially foolish. Other criminals who'd moved into drugs were making fortunes. The younger generation looked at him with some respect, but also with pity for being left behind. This was partly conscious choice. He'd decided some money wasn't worth the cost, but it was partly that he was simply too old, too set in his ways to adapt. The mob was less dependent on him now. They had new Harlem contacts, younger black criminals willing to manage drug operations without Bumpy's moral reservations. He could have retired. He had legitimate businesses that could support him comfortably. But retirement wasn't realistic. You didn't resign from organized crime. The mob wouldn't accept losing their connection to someone who knew as much as Bumpy knew. And honestly, he didn't know who he'd be without the life he'd built. His identity was so bound up with being Bumpy Johnson that becoming just another retired old man seemed like death by a different name. In 1963, Bumpy was arrested on federal narcotics conspiracy charges, despite having avoided direct involvement in heroin distribution. The indictment alleged he'd facilitated drug operations through his contacts, providing protection and logistics even if not touching product himself. This was technically accurate. His trial was a media spectacle. The government portrayed him as a criminal mastermind, controlling Harlem's drug trade. His lawyers presented him as a legitimate businessman, being scapegoated. Both narratives were partially true. The jury convicted him. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, a sentence that, given his age and health, essentially meant dying behind bars. The conviction sent shockwaves through Harlem's underworld. Bumpy Johnson, seemingly untouchable for decades, had fallen. His imprisonment created a power vacuum that various criminals rushed to fill. Without his moderating influence, violence escalated. The heroin trade, no longer constrained by even his limited resistance, exploded completely. Many people who'd criticized Bumpy while he was free now recognized that his presence had actually imposed some limits. Without him, chaos ruled. Bumpy's time in federal prison was difficult. He was older than most inmates, which made him vulnerable. He had to prove he was still dangerous enough that attacking him wasn't worth the cost. His health deteriorated significantly. He had a minor heart attack in 1965, emerged weaker than before. But he also used his time productively. He read extensively, educating himself, developing more sophisticated understanding of the social forces that had shaped his life. He read about structural racism, economic exploitation, the systemic barriers that had made criminal enterprise seem like the only viable path. This reading didn't excuse his crimes, but it contextualized them. His lawyers worked on appeals, and in 1969, after serving 6 years, his sentence was reduced, and he was released on parole. He walked out at 64 years old, physically diminished but mentally sharp, returning to a Harlem that had changed dramatically. The neighborhood he'd left in 1963 no longer existed. Urban renewal had demolished huge sections. The heroin epidemic had reached catastrophic proportions. Many old associates were dead or imprisoned. Bumpy was a man out of time, a remnant of an earlier era returning to a world that had moved past him. The first weeks of freedom were disorienting. He'd expected to resume control, only to discover there wasn't much organization left to control. His name still carried weight, but memory was fading. Younger criminals knew him only as a legend. He reconnected with remaining associates. The news was uniformly grim. Heroin had consumed everything. Numbers gambling was dying. Nothing was easy anymore. Bumpy assessed the situation with cold pragmatism. He was 64, recently released, physically diminished. He couldn't reclaim his former position through force. But he still had his mind, his experience, his understanding of power. He started by reestablishing his relationship with the mob. They were surprised to hear from him, but they took his calls. He was straightforward about his situation. He'd been away. Things had changed. He understood he couldn't simply reclaim his old position. But he had value to offer. He knew Harlem intimately. If the mob was having trouble managing their Harlem operations, he could provide consultation services. The Italians were indeed having problems. The young black criminals they'd elevated were capable but unstable, generating violence that attracted attention. They agreed to a limited arrangement. Bumpy would provide advice and community liaison services. In exchange, he'd receive a modest stipend. It wasn't the partnership of equals he'd once enjoyed, but it was something. He began rebuilding carefully. He reopened some small numbers operations, not trying to compete with major organizations, but serving customers who preferred dealing with someone they knew. He offered mediation services to criminals in conflict. None of this generated the wealth or power he'd once commanded, but it kept him active, relevant, connected. His health remained precarious. The heart condition worsened. Doctor visits became routine. He was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. His relationship with Harlem's community during this period was complex and poignant. Older residents remembered him with mixed feelings. Younger people mostly didn't know who he was. The Black Power movement had created new heroes, activists who confronted white supremacy directly rather than accommodating it through backroom deals. He attended community meetings occasionally, sitting quietly in the back. He had complicated feelings about what he heard. Part of him thrilled to the militancy, but part of him worried. These young activists didn't understand how power actually worked. He wanted to share wisdom, to explain that revolution required strategy as much as courage. But he understood he had no credibility with them. He was a criminal, a relic of the accommodation they rejected. So he stayed quiet, occasionally helping behind the scenes. When activists needed bail money, sometimes anonymous donations appeared. Bumpy was supporting the movement he could never publicly join. His final confrontation with changes in Harlem came through an encounter with Nicky Barnes, a heroin kingpin who'd built an empire on addiction's devastation. The two men met at a social event. The conversation was polite but tense. Barnes was respectful but condescending, treating Bumpy like an honored predecessor who'd been surpassed. Bumpy listened, then asked a simple question. How did Barnes sleep at night, knowing what his product did to people? Barnes responded defensively. Someone would sell heroin regardless. At least he was from Harlem, kept some money in the community. Bumpy shook his head. There was taking control of your destiny, and there was destroying your community for profit while rationalizing it as empowerment. Barnes went on to even greater success before his inevitable fall. Arrested in 1978, sentenced to life, later became an informant. His fate was exactly what Bumpy had predicted. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson had become a symbol, not of criminal success alone, but of a particular moment in American history when boundaries between criminal and legitimate, between exploitation and empowerment, were blurred enough that someone like him could exist in moral ambiguity. The younger generation wanted clearer lines. His legacy was being debated even while he still lived. Academic researchers interviewed him. Journalists profiled him as a dying breed. Activists analyzed him as a case study in how systemic oppression channels people into criminality. Everyone had theories about what Bumpy Johnson meant. He found most of these interpretations incomplete at best. The academics saw him as a product of structural forces, which was true, but insufficient. Yes, racism had shaped his choices, but he'd still made choices. The journalists romanticized him, turning his life into a gangster movie. The activists were harshest, seeing him as a collaborator who'd enriched himself by accommodating white supremacy. The truth was more complicated than any narrative. He'd been a criminal, yes, exploiting his community's poverty. That was indefensible. But he'd also been a protector, preventing worse exploitation. He'd collaborated with the mob, but that collaboration had prevented complete mob takeover. He was neither hero nor villain, but some complex combination of both simultaneously. The only person who understood this complexity without judgment was Mamie. She'd lived with his contradictions for decades, understood that humans were complicated. Her love didn't require him to be a hero. It accepted him as he was. As his health deteriorated, they talked more openly about his legacy. What would he be remembered for? Had his life mattered? He honestly didn't know. He'd done some good and considerable harm. The balance sheet was ambiguous. What bothered him most was the young people destroyed by heroin. He'd refused to deal drugs himself, which he took some pride in. But his refusal hadn't stopped the trade. Maybe if he'd been willing to compromise, he could have managed distribution in ways that minimized harm. Or maybe that was rationalization. He spent increasing time at home, his outings becoming rarer. He read voraciously, followed politics obsessively. He watched the 1968 chaos, King's and Kennedy's assassinations, Nixon's election. The world was convulsing. All the structural problems that had shaped his life remained largely unaddressed. He wondered what a young Bumpy Johnson would do in 1968. Would he still choose criminality, or would expanding opportunities offer viable alternatives? He wanted to believe things had improved, but he wasn't sure. He tried occasionally to warn young people away from the life he'd lived. Most didn't listen. They saw his life as proof you could succeed if you were smart enough. They didn't see the costs that success had required. His death, when it came on July 7th, 1968, was anticlimactic. He suffered a massive heart attack while having breakfast at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, a place he'd frequented for decades. He collapsed suddenly, unconscious before he hit the ground. Paramedics couldn't revive him. He was pronounced dead at the hospital, 62 years old, dead of natural causes, or as natural as anything could be for someone who'd lived the life he'd lived. The funeral was well attended, drawing an unlikely mix of mourners. Legitimate community leaders came, honoring a complicated figure who'd been part of Harlem's fabric for decades. Criminals came, paying respects to a legend. Ordinary residents came, some grateful for help he'd provided, others simply curious. The mob sent representatives, acknowledgement that he'd been a valued associate. Mamie sat in the front row, dignified in her grief. She'd prepared for this for years, knowing his health was failing. But preparation didn't eliminate pain. The eulogies were carefully calibrated, acknowledging Bumpy's criminal life while emphasizing his community contributions. Ministers spoke about redemption. Friends spoke about his loyalty and intelligence. Community leaders spoke about his protection of Harlem during difficult times. Nobody mentioned the violence, the exploitation, the collaboration with mob forces. That would come later, in more analytical assessments. The funeral was for mourning, for honoring the dead even when the dead were complicated. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in a plot he'd purchased years earlier. The gravestone was simple, listing his name, dates, and nothing else. Just the basic facts. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, born 1905, died 1968. Let others decide what those 63 years meant. The legend of Bumpy Johnson didn't end with his death. If anything, it intensified, freed from the complications of the living man to become something more mythic. In the immediate aftermath, he was remembered primarily in Harlem, where stories emphasized his protection of the community, his standing up to white mob exploitation. These stories weren't false exactly, but they were selective, highlighting aspects that fit preferred narratives while minimizing the exploitation and violence. As the 1970s progressed and heroin's devastation became impossible to ignore, Bumpy's reputation underwent revision. Some pointed to his refusal to deal drugs as evidence of his ethical boundaries. They contrasted him favorably with the new generation of drug dealers. This comparison allowed people to nostalgize a past when even criminals supposedly had codes. Whether this past actually existed didn't matter much. The contrast with the present was too useful to abandon. Others saw his story as a cautionary tale about how structural racism created conditions where criminality seemed rational. Bumpy hadn't been born wanting to be a gangster. He'd been born into a society that offered him almost no legitimate paths to success. In that context, turning to crime wasn't moral failure so much as strategic adaptation. This analysis had truth, but also removed Bumpy's agency, turning him into merely a product of social forces. Academic interest grew in the 1980s and 90s as scholars recognized him as a significant figure. Dissertations analyzed his career. Books examined his role in Harlem's criminal economy. This scholarship was more nuanced than popular accounts, acknowledging both his crimes and his complexity. But academic work reached limited audiences. For most people, Bumpy Johnson remained a folk hero, a Robin Hood figure, which wasn't remotely accurate, but made for compelling storytelling. Popular culture discovered him eventually. He appeared in movies and television shows, almost always as a supporting character. These portrayals varied wildly. Wise mentor figure, tragic victim of circumstances, ruthless gangster. All contained elements of truth. Bumpy had been all those things at different times, but no single portrayal captured his full complexity, the ways he'd been simultaneously exploiter and protector, collaborator and resistor. The most significant cultural representations came decades after his death, in films and series that used his life as foundation for fictional narratives. These productions took liberties with history, creating composite characters, inventing dramatic confrontations, simplifying complex negotiations. Entertainment required this simplification. Audiences couldn't tolerate the moral ambiguity that defined the actual Bumpy Johnson's life. Mamie Johnson, surviving him by several decades, watched this mythologizing with mixed feelings. She knew the real man, had lived with his contradictions. She gave occasional interviews, trying to provide more nuanced perspective. But fighting mythology with reality is a losing battle. People wanted simple stories. She could offer complicated truth, but that wasn't what audiences sought. She eventually stopped trying to correct the record, accepting that Bumpy's public image would be whatever people needed it to be, regardless of historical accuracy. The moral of Bumpy Johnson's story cuts through decades of myth-making to reach uncomfortable truths about American society. He was a criminal, absolutely. Someone who broke laws, hurt people, and enriched himself through exploitation. No amount of contextualization erases those facts. But he was also a product of a system that intentionally limited Black Americans' opportunities, that channeled them toward criminality through discrimination and neglect. You can't understand Bumpy Johnson without understanding Jim Crow, without acknowledging that American society offered him essentially no legitimate paths to the success he achieved illegally. This doesn't excuse his choices. Many people face the same structural racism without turning to crime, but it contextualizes those choices, helps explain why someone intelligent and capable chose criminal enterprise over legitimate struggle. The legitimate struggle offered grinding poverty as its best-case scenario. Criminality offered at least a chance at wealth and power. The risk-reward calculation made sense, even if the moral calculation didn't. His collaboration with the Italian mob represents another uncomfortable truth. Marginalized groups often survive by making deals with oppressors. Bumpy couldn't fight the mob militarily. They had superior force. So he negotiated, finding ways to maintain some autonomy while acknowledging their superior power. This was accommodation, working within systems he couldn't destroy. Revolutionary rhetoric condemns such compromise as selling out. But people actually living in oppressive systems often find that pure resistance means pure destruction, while strategic accommodation allows survival and maybe limited progress. The question his life poses is whether such accommodation ultimately helps or hurts. On one hand, his deals prevented complete mob takeover, maintained some local control, kept some money circulating in Harlem. On the other hand, his collaboration made mob exploitation more efficient, gave it legitimacy. Both narratives are true simultaneously. His refusal to enter the heroin trade stands as his most unambiguous moral position. Whatever other crimes he committed, he drew a line at drug dealing. This choice cost him commercially, probably contributed to his eventual marginalization. But it was a real ethical boundary, proof that even compromised people can have principles. The fact that his refusal didn't stop Harlem's heroin epidemic complicates this legacy. He maintained his principles, but to what end? The drugs flooded in anyway. His moral stance may have been personally satisfying, but was practically irrelevant. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson. Individual moral choices matter, but aren't sufficient to change systemic problems. Real change required systemic transformation, addressing poverty, providing legitimate opportunities, creating treatment infrastructure. These were beyond any criminal's power to implement. His life also demonstrates the cost of living in moral ambiguity. The stress of maintaining multiple identities, ruthless criminal, community benefactor, mob collaborator, race man, family man, took visible toll. He aged rapidly, developed serious health problems, died relatively young. The psychological burden of carrying contradictory identities, of knowing you'd harmed people while believing you'd also helped them, was immense. Most people solve this tension by choosing one identity. Bumpy maintained the tension throughout his life, which required strength but also created internal conflict that never resolved. For contemporary audiences, Bumpy Johnson's story raises questions about how we judge people who operate in constrained circumstances. If someone born into structural oppression achieves success through illegal means, how should we evaluate them? Do we condemn the criminality while ignoring the context that made it rational? Do we excuse the criminality because of the context? Do we acknowledge both the context and the choices, holding people accountable while recognizing the systems that shaped their options? There are no easy answers, which is precisely why Bumpy's story remains compelling. It forces us to think about structural injustice, individual agency, moral complexity, and the ways these elements interact in real lives. His relationship with Harlem's community raises questions about complicity and compromise. The community knew he was a criminal but accepted him anyway, took his money, used his services. Were they complicit in his crimes? Or were they making rational decisions to survive in an economy that offered limited options? When Bumpy paid for church programs or helped families facing eviction, was he genuinely helping? Or was he buying loyalty that protected his criminal operations? Again, probably both simultaneously. His help was real and meaningful to recipients, but it also served his interests, creating social capital that made his criminal enterprise sustainable. The comparison between Bumpy's era and contemporary times is instructive. Many of the conditions that shaped his life, structural racism, economic marginalization, discriminatory law enforcement, persist today in evolved forms. The specific legal framework of Jim Crow is gone, but racial disparities in wealth, education, employment, and criminal justice remain stark. Contemporary young people facing limited legitimate opportunities make choices similar to those Bumpy made, following logic that made sense to him decades ago, while acknowledging that we've created systems that make criminality rational for too many people. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the same year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the same year that political and social upheaval reached peak intensity. His death marked the end of an era in Harlem's history, the passing of the old-school criminals who dominated the neighborhood's underworld since Prohibition. The new generation that followed operated differently, more violently, more destructively, with fewer ethical boundaries and less community connection. Whether this was progress or decline depends on perspective. Arguably, the old-school criminals' paternalistic community relations were themselves exploitative, just with better public relations. His legacy remains contested, which seems appropriate for someone who lived in moral ambiguity. Some remember him as a folk hero who protected Harlem. Others remember him as a criminal who exploited his own community. Still others see him as a complex figure who was both things simultaneously. All these remembrances contain truth. Bumpy Johnson was all these things, and more: criminal and protector, exploiter and benefactor, collaborator and resistor, violent man and strategic thinker, devoted husband and ruthless operator. If there's wisdom to extract from his story, it might be this: judge people in context, but don't let context erase accountability. Bumpy Johnson made choices, exercised agency, decided repeatedly to pursue criminal paths. He's responsible for those choices and their consequences. But those choices were made in specific historical circumstances that shaped available options and altered risk-reward calculations. Understanding context doesn't excuse crimes, but it helps explain why someone intelligent and capable chose the paths he did. His story also teaches that survival in oppressive systems often requires compromise, accommodation, working with forces you'd rather oppose. This is uncomfortable truth that revolutionary rhetoric rejects, but that most people living under oppression eventually learn. Pure resistance feels noble, but often means destruction. Strategic accommodation feels like selling out, but sometimes allows survival and gradual progress. The challenge is maintaining some ethical boundaries, even while compromising, drawing lines that won't be crossed, even when crossing them would be profitable. Bumpy drew that line at heroin, which distinguished him from many contemporaries and successors. It wasn't enough to make him admirable, but it was something. Finally, his life demonstrates that human beings contain contradictions, that good people do bad things, and bad people do good things, that moral categories are often inadequate for capturing actual human complexity. Bumpy Johnson was neither hero nor villain, but a person, flawed and struggling, and trying to make sense of circumstances that offered no good options. He succeeded by criminal measures, building wealth and power. He failed by moral measures, hurting people and communities. He was both successful and failed simultaneously, which is perhaps the most human condition possible. The outlaws stopped laughing at the black gangster who negotiated with the Mafia over 50 years ago. The mobsters who thought he'd never command respect are long dead themselves. The system that enslaved his ancestors and oppressed his generation has evolved into forms both better and worse. But Bumpy Johnson's story persists, told and retold, reshaped by each generation's needs, serving as mirror to American society's ongoing struggle with race, crime, justice, and survival. He was a product of his time who also transcended it, a criminal who also protected, a man who contained multitudes. Whether that life added up to something meaningful or was simply sound and fury signifying nothing remains debatable. He died uncertain about his own legacy. Perhaps that uncertainty was the wisest thing about him, the recognition that we're all too close to our own lives to judge them accurately, that history's verdict awaits time and perspective we can never possess while living. His grave in Woodlawn Cemetery receives occasional visitors still, people curious about the legend or grateful for help he provided decades ago. The stone says nothing about who he was or what he did, just his name, his dates, the simple facts. Let those who visit supply the interpretation. Let history judge whether Ellsworth Raymond, Bumpy Johnson, was savior or criminal, hero or villain, or perhaps most accurately, a complicated man who lived in complicated times and did what he thought necessary to survive. The complexity was always the point. The refusal to fit neat categories, the existence in moral ambiguity, the demonstration that real lives are messier than simple stories allow. If remembering Bumpy Johnson teaches anything, it's that humans are complicated, that judgment requires context without erasing accountability, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that refuse to offer comfortable conclusions. They said a black gangster could never deal with the Mafia. Bumpy Johnson proved them wrong, forged his own path through impossible circumstances, built an empire where none should have existed. Whether that empire was worth the cost, whether his compromises were justified, whether his legacy deserves respect or condemnation, these questions remain open, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. And maybe that ambiguity is the most honest conclusion of all.